In this lecture we will discuss the grid security infrastructure. Before you can use the grid compute and storage resources, you have to set up your identity on the grid. Your jobs will run on distributed machines that can be scattered all over the world. To avoid logging into each resource separately with a username and password, and that the site administrators know who is using the machines, you will use a personal certificate that will identify you on the grid. You can compare it to a passport or universal key that automatically unlocks every door you are allowed to open. Which door you are allowed to open, in other words, which resource you are allowed to use, is determined by your virtual organization. During this week we will provide you with the basics of grid security and all the necessary information to request a personal certificate, get a VO membership and install the certificate in your environment. Grid security is very complex, so this lecture will try to give you the insight of various mechanisms that enable security in such a complicated distributed environment. First, we will give you an overview of the grid security infrastructure and then discuss the delegation procedure that takes place on grid services behind the scenes. But first, we need to discuss the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication is the ability to identify yourself with some kind of approved credential. Basically, a trust means that tells someone you are really the person that you claim to be. Your passport is such a means and works around the globe as a method of identifying yourself. However, having a passport does not necessarily grant you access to every country. That's what visas are for. Here we come to authorization, which happens after someone's identity has been established. When traveling to a foreign country, you often need some type of approval for visiting that country, which means that you have to register for a visa. When entering that country, both the authentication, so your passport itself, and the authorization, the visa, will be checked. Only after both have been approved you are allowed in. Grid security works similar to the passport visa scheme, where your grid certificate acts as a passport and your VO membership as a visa, as we shall see in the following slides. Let's take a look at what the grid security mechanisms are trying to achieve by following the chain of trust between you, the user, and the resource provider. On the left you have the user, on the bottom right the resource provider. It's fair to assume that they have and never will meet, but the user would still like to be able to use the remote resources. So first, he needs to be able to identify himself, which can be done using a grid certificate. The person that can create these certificates is called the CA, or Certificate Authority. As she won't be able to handle this for every possible user that comes along, she has a small number of people that she entrusts with this task. These are called the RAs, or Registration Authorities. These people are usually associated with a scientific institute. The user can visit the RA, bring along some form of identification. The RA makes sure that the identification is valid and that the user is associated with the scientific institute that he is able to sign for. He hands this information to the CA, after which the certificate is created and sent to the user. On the other side, the resource provider and groups wanting to use the resources need to be able to trust each other as well. This is why users are organized in so-called virtual organizations. These VOs usually represent a common research field, or even a research experiment. These can, for example, be VOs for life sciences and experiments like Atlas. The VO manager negotiates the usage of resources with resource providers. When this is granted, every member of a particular VO can use those resources. Now we can close a chain between the user and the resource provider. The user is able to authenticate himself to the VO manager, which can grant access to the VO. As the VO manager has already negotiated the usage of remote resources, the user is now able to utilize the resources of the remote site. The grid security infrastructure provides all the protocols, services and standards in a framework that supports grid computing. However, it's exceptionally difficult to achieve a trustful relationship in a complex and heterogeneous environment. So, why is this so hard? Interactions on grid are not just client-server, but client-to-service on behalf of the users as well. Thus there is a need of authentication to establish that individuals are who they claim to be and restrict access accordingly. The access control on grid is based on authorization and VO policies, as we have seen in the previous slide with the passport example. Standardization of interfaces is necessary to allow discovery of resources and use of tools and protocols in a transparent way. And trust is difficult to achieve between organizations, because different resources are distributed, users and their needs differ. The primary motivations behind the grid security infrastructure are the data confidentiality, so there's a need for secure communication for the exchange of information. Sensitive information and data must be protected from eavesdroppers. Data integrity, this is required to assure that messages were not modified in transit without authorization, or intentionally or accidentally. And delegation, the grid service infrastructure or grid security infrastructure provides mechanisms for single sign-on to allow delegation of user credentials, as we will see later. The GSI uses public key cryptography, also known as asymmetric cryptography, as the basis of its functionality. The grid certificates bind together your identity, so your name, affiliation, etc., and a unique piece of digital data called a public key. A third party that is trusted by all sites in the grid infrastructure will sign the combination of your name and that public key. The authentication method relies on a special mathematical trick called asymmetric cryptography, and the communication is achieved over an open network. More specifically, the GSI is based on X509 certificates and the Secure Circuit Layer Communication Protocol. The X509 certificate is issued by your certification authority, or CA, as we have seen in a demonstration already. When you have this certificate, the user can access grid resources based on the privileges that his virtual organization membership permits. Finally, the user can submit jobs by creating a proxy based on his personal certificate. The job will carry a copy of the proxy to be allowed to access and run on a grid node. So let's take a look at what this certificate actually looks like. The certificate is an envelope which ties together two parts, the certificate body and the digital signature. The GSI certificates are encoded by the 509 certificate format, a standard data format for certificates. The important factor to know about these digital certificates is that the CA certifies that the enclosed public key belongs to the user listed in the certificate. So the certificate includes the following details. So the issuer and the issuer's distinguished name. This is the CA that signed the certificate. The validity, basically the period in which the certificate is valid. Before or after the period here, the certificate is worthless. So there's the subject. This is the name of the user, and it's encoded as a distinguished name. And then there's the subject or the user's public key. This includes not only the key itself, but information such as the algorithm used to generate the public key, and some extensions, various bits of information saying what it is. And then finally there's a digital signature. All information in the certificate signed by the CA's private key. That's why it's unreadable. The core GSI software expects the user's private key to be stored in a file on the local computer storage. To prevent other users of the computer from stealing the private key, the file that contains the key is encrypted using a password. The grid certificate is actually quite valuable, and even though there is a chain of trust between all the parts involved, you would still like to keep it mostly to yourself. Keep in mind that you could be submitting jobs into unknown territory, and that each time you do, there exists a security hazard for your certificate to become exposed. This issue has been solved with certificate delegation, creating a short-lived copy of your own certificate which is sent with your jobs and acts as a placeholder for the real one. This makes sure that, even if the certificate is compromised, it can only be used for a very small amount of time. The GSI provides a delegation capability due to an extension of the standard SSL protocol. This is achieved by creating a proxy certificate. A proxy consists of a new certificate with a new public key in it and a new private key. The new certificate contains the owner's identity, modified slightly to indicate it is a proxy. The new certificate is signed by the owner rather than the CA. Proxies have limited lifetimes of approximately 12 hours. As we see in this picture, a proxy certificate has a private public key pair generated specifically for the proxy certificate. This private public key pair is mutually agreed upon by both parties, in this case A and B, and organization A will only allow the holder of that private public key pair to act on its behalf, in this case B. This process reduces the number of times the user must enter his passphrase, enabling single sign-on. So, let's take a look at how proxy generation works. The certificate of the CA is self-signed and can be used to sign user certificates. In turn, the user certificate, which has a password, generates and signs a temporary certificate called a proxy. The proxy is used for the actual authentication to grid services and does not need a password. Thus, we don't need our personal certificate and key to authenticate ourselves to the grid. As possession of the proxy certificate is a proof of identity but only has a short lifetime, typically 12 hours, this is set by default to reduce security risks should it be stolen. A proxy certificate is not signed by a CA but by the user who issues it. The whole process is called delegation. During that time, the grid middleware can work on your behalf. In security terms, a proxy is a compromise, since the private key is sent with it and is not protected by a passphrase. Anyone who steals it can impersonate the owner, so proxies need to be treated carefully. Also, there's no mechanism of revoking proxies, so in general, even if someone knows that one has been stolen, there is little they can do to stop it being used, apart from revoking the user certificate itself. On the other hand, proxies usually have a lifetime of only a few hours, so the potential damage is fairly limited. Certificates can also have VO extensions, which are like visas in the sense that they enable authorization. To be able to use any hardware resources, you need these to be enabled. Also keep in mind that you can only use one virtual organization at any one time. So if you are a member of multiple virtual organizations, at the time you create your proxy certificate, you will need to choose one of them. The last but very important capability of GSI is the MyProxy certificate. This is needed when a user wants to submit jobs which last longer than the default 12 hours that the proxy is valid. For long-running jobs, the job proxy may expire before the job is finished, causing the job to fail. To avoid this, there's a proxy renewal mechanism to keep the job proxy valid for as long as needed, at least for up to a week. This service thus acts on the user's behalf, creating a new proxy certificate when the old one is about to expire. The user can request a MyProxy service to do this for up to a week. The long proxy is stored on the MyProxy server and the renewal may be performed without a passphrase. You might wonder how using the MyProxy server differs from just having a certificate that lasts longer. In essence, the MyProxy service is something that you can trust to do this task for you more than you would decide that you would send your longer-lived certificate to. It also allows you to destroy the certificate located on the service so that it no longer can be used. We will see all the described GSI features during the rest of the week. The next lecture will show you how to get a grid certificate. So to sum up this lecture, the grid certificate that you request from a CA is a means to authenticate yourself on the grid. The default extensions on top of your certificate enable you to authorize yourself and get access to resources. The proxy or short-lived certificates are used to keep your real certificate safe on your local machine or on user interface that you are using. And the MyProxy service acts as an agent which can create proxy certificates for up to a week.